Yeah, so here we are in this time of coronavirus and a much changed world. I think the case for what I'm going to focus on today, ranked choice voting, um, in some ways is more powerfully clear as a value than ever, as we see this understandable move toward talking about voting by mail and voting at home. That raises both opportunities and values associated with ranked choice voting. And I'll say that what I'm going to talk about tonight isn't the complete answer to what we need to do to make our democracy what we want. We just for this year, we obviously need to be looking at those basic questions of access so that people can vote safely and securely and with full access. And there's going to be a lot of work to need to do that. And so just make sure you're connected with for those that are wanting to make sure that both the primary elections, like in New Jersey, and the general elections in the fall happen and happen well. A lot of work needs to be done. There's some great work going on out there. My belief is that governors are ultimately the ones that we can make most accountable for making sure that elections go well in their state, but a lot of other actors need to make that happen too. Congress needs to appropriate more funds and so on. Ranked choice voting, though, is something of deep importance to me. I've been working on these issues since the early 90s, and it's been a sort of remarkable trajectory the last few years of seeing that work come to fruition with whole states voting, going to this new way of voting, ranked choice voting, where it passed in Maine. New York City has passed it. Will be using it next year. We've been working in a number of states where the parties are using ranked choice voting in the presidential primaries. We just had 2 that reported out, and I'll talk some about that tonight. I think in this format, I won't be able to do the usual thing of like ask people to raise their hand or see if people are smiling or laughing or grumbling or what have you. So I think what will be useful for me is to get relatively quick into questions. I do have a presentation that I'm going to do, so I'm going to go ahead and flip to the presentation mode here. Before I do that, I just wanted to thank Rhoda again for in the network for connecting me to you all and for the work that you do in encouraging conversations about important topics. So let me make sure I can shift into the sharing the screen mode, and so we'll do this this PowerPoint. And while I'm doing this, while I'm doing this, I will not be looking at questions just because when I looked, it seemed to cover half the screen for me. And so, but please ask your questions whenever they come up in this. And as we shift into that mode, the questions will be there, and we obviously can just take them and try to sort them as this goes forward. So again, I work at FairVote.org. We're a national organization. There's really an exciting network of organizations working on this now. Other groups like Represent Us nationally, Common Cause is starting to work on it in more places, and a lot of really strong state groups and state efforts, and it's really kind of exciting to see what's been happening with the organization. We have the head of Californians for Electoral Reform is on the with us tonight. So the current method of voting, which I assume most of you have had a chance to participate in, is one that we would describe as a winner-take-all single-choice electoral system. In some ways, hey, one person, one vote, isn't that what democracy is all about? And what I'm going to be talking about tonight is how one person, one vote doesn't mean just being able to cast one vote, but actually it means equality, and it means the opportunity for everyone to vote fully. And we're not, I think, really living up to the goal of one person vote, one vote when we're stuck with a single choice system. So that's the, an early look at the presidential ballot last year on the Democratic side. Big number of candidates, you only get to vote for one. That actually ballot continued in a form like that well into the presidential season. And what you can have with a system like that is that you're just not saying much about a lot of candidates. So, even when you add just a third choice, let alone 15 choices, you can have someone who wins the most votes, but not half the votes. And in fact, they might be strongly opposed by half the voters. In the classic dynamics involving, did the person with the most votes win just because there was a quote unquote spoiler candidate or a split vote? And voters are all in, like going through these mind traps of saying, well, can I vote for the person I really like? If I do that, will I help elect the one I least like? And that happens when third parties and independents run in our system regularly. But we see it all the time in primary elections, in the 2016 Republican cycle, 2020 Democratic one, big fields, you only get to vote for one, and it really has an effect on outcomes and the nature of campaigns. So, George Bush, father and son, had sort of their different experiences with the current system back in '92, the presidential election. Ross Perot, who just recently died, but he, back in that election, was the strongest independent candidate in a long, long time, won 19% of the vote. And by doing that, Bill Clinton, who won the most votes, didn't come close to half the votes. And in fact, only one state out of 50 that year was one with a majority. 49 were not. And arguably, it affected that outcome. It certainly affected the outcome in some states. Then you flip up to 2000, where Al Gore was running against George Bush the Younger, and Ralph Nader got a lot fewer votes than Ross Perot, but perhaps a more impactful percentage of votes in the effect it had on the who won and lost. And so the person with the most votes, well, in this case, it's complicated by this slide because, of course, Gore got the most votes on the popular vote, but in Florida, he actually did not get the most votes, and that ends up allowing someone to win who arguably would not have won in a one-on-one race. So what do you do with a ranked choice voting ballot? It really is quite straightforward. It's saying, you know what? Give voters a backup. Let them have the chance to do their first choice, but that's not necessarily everything that they have to say about the election. So this is an opportunity to cast a backup. So the ballot needs to present ranking opportunities. And so you say your first choice, then your second choice, and your third choice. If you only have one choice, that's fine. But if you have backups, that's all you need to do. And we'll go into some slides that just show how easy it is for voters to do that. So what that means from that simple change is that voters, you can have more choices without the election being as directly affected by just the entry of new candidates. It really reduces that spoiler impact of having a third party or independent candidate, because now you can vote for them and you can still have their backup, and we'll explain that in a moment. Because of the dynamics of how it works, where now you as a voter have this different power, your ability to do a second and third choice, and the candidates know that. They treat more voters seriously. They try to find out what more people think. People who win ranked choice voting contests don't stop with just getting 51, 52%. They usually end up getting highly ranked by 65, 70% of voters, because they're finding out ways to make connections. And that often has an impact on the tenor of campaigns. And then you're much more likely to get a candidate who is a majority candidate. So how does this instant runoff voting work? That's the when you're electing a single person, you have the first round of votes, which is those first choices on the ballot. And if someone wins over 50%, then you have a winner, right? It's just like a regular election. But if not, you count up the votes, and the candidate who's in last place loses. So that candidate is out because they're in last place. You look at their ballots, and voters have had this chance to indicate a second choice, and the ballot is then moved to their second choice. In this case, these are the new results. You still don't have a majority winner. You continue, and then you get down to a head-to-head contest. And at that point, when the ballots are consolidated and you get that head-to-head, you get something like 54 to 46 or some kind of straightforward majority outcome. Why it's called an instant runoff is you're getting down to 2, and you're really finding out who wins a head-to-head contest. So this was a real election that just was done. The Alaska Democratic Party used ranked choice voting in its presidential primary. Wyoming did. They released the results last week. Kansas Democrats are doing it in a few weeks, and Hawaii Democrats. We thought actually a lot of those contests were going to be decided on Saturday, April 4th, sort of our ranked choice voting Super Saturday. The coronavirus kind of changed things because they closed down in-person voting and just made it an all-mail ballot. They sort of slowed down the counting. But the fundamentals were really good. It wasn't as exciting because we all know who's won the Democratic nomination, but when most of these voters voted, they did not know that yet. And so this was from an education slide done during the run-up to the vote in Alaska. And sort of the messaging about what it means for you as a voter is shown here. So on the right, you can see something that's very close to what the ballot looked like. The candidates were a little different than that, but you know, they were the Democrat candidates. And then, so, you know, the first choice is the candidate you love, the candidate you really want to win. The second choice is the candidate you like, you know, and it doesn't have to be exactly this, but this is sort of the general psychology. Third and fourth, you know, you still like them, but not as much, but, you know, you still want them to win. Maybe when you're down to the fifth choice, it's a candidate that you can tolerate, a candidate that you can stand, but you still want them to beat the candidates that remain. So they, whoops, see if, oh, there. See if it's work. Okay, so how did it actually work? So one, Alaska had in-person voting the last 2 times it was competitive. This time was vote by mail with ranked choice voting. The number of people that voted was twice what it had been in 2008 and almost twice of 2008. Biden won a plurality in Alaska. The first choice is just under 50%. But when it got down to the head-to-head with Bernie Sanders, who was the second place candidate, it was 55 to 45. So we kind of clarified that he wasn't winning only because of a split vote, and it sort of showed a clear outcome. There were 11% of voters who did not rank Biden or Sanders first. And by the time those ballots were counted, those candidates had dropped out. You know, Sanders has actually dropped out now too, but let's sort of particularly focus on them, because nationally, we've had more than 2 million votes counted for candidates who have already dropped out by the time that they were counted, when the contest was still very much active. And so that was true of 11% of voters in Alaska. And yet, because of ranked choice voting, over 9 out of 10 of them had ranked Sanders or Biden and had their ballot count for them in the last round. And if that had been done nationally, that would have kept 2 million more votes in play, just sort of showing a straightforward value of ranked choice voting. So it's being used a lot. When I started in the 90s, the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts was using the proportional representation form of ranked choice voting. It was the only use of it. Now you can see all these different uses going on around the country. The most significant for many people is Maine, where it is used for all their big primary elections. And this November will be used for US president in a very competitive swing state, in the Senate race, which is one of the most contested Senate races in the country with Susan Collins, and in 2 of their House races, one of which is one of the big classic House races. So it'd be very important for outcomes, and it's a state with a lot of independent and third-party backing voters. So it's one where ranked choice voting has a real impact. We have a couple cities in Utah using, actually this weekend, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are using it at their state conventions. And we expect a number of cities to add to the 2 that are already using it before the 2021 elections. We've got San Francisco and Berkeley and Oakland and San Leandro, California have been using it for a decade or more. And just a whole mix of cities around the country. Minneapolis is one of the most important uses, and New York City has passed it for next year. A whole bunch of colleges and universities use it, and NGOs, and it's really exciting for me. Just in some ways, it's obviously not momentous that all these colleges and universities are doing it, but it's indicative of something I think important, which is that young people seem to really be very receptive to this way of voting. This has been something that's been very organic, and students finding out about it on campuses around the country, and it's a whole eclectic, interesting mix of schools. It's not just your kind of usual suspects. I mean, you got Ivy League schools, you got a whole bunch of California schools, you got like Chinese schools in Arkansas, you've got Auburn, you got Boise State. You just got a kind of a mix of places. It is, by the way, you know, kind of in some ways just a very practical system that's used in a lot of NGOs. It's often called preferential voting in parliamentary guides. As an example of just it being kind of accepted for that use is all the Canadian parties, that national, there's 5 national parties in Canada. They all elect their leaders with ranked choice voting now. even though they don't necessarily all support it for using it in the general election, they all think it's the best way to pick their own leaders. So at the local level, and that'll be a conversation that I hope happens in New Jersey and is happening in more and more places. Some of the arguments are a little different than when you're talking about partisan elections and split votes with the Green Party or the Libertarian Party or what have you. In some ways, it's just practical that it can save money because it often means you can go from 2 elections to 1. I know that's actually a lot of New Jersey elections have that kind of runoff. And when you have 2 elections to get to a majority winner, ranked choice voting is effectively doing that in 1 trip to the polls. And particularly when there are challenges in holding polling elections, like with the coronavirus or getting ballots out by mail and then needing to get them out a second time, ranked choice voting makes particular sense. And I think it really is kind of a straightforward value to have candidates need to reach out to more people. I have it in my town of Tacoma Park here, and it's in Maryland, and it just is, you can just see it. I mean, people knock on your door and talk to you, even if you have a sign for someone else. There's that conversation just happens. So nationally, there are bills in Congress, and that's something that FairVote is really starting to focus more and more on, because we ultimately think this is a national change. I believe we can get big national changes in this coming decade. The Ranked Choice Voting Act would apply ranked choice voting across all congressional elections. That's a power that Congress has to establish for its own elections in one fell swoop. Even more ambitiously is the Fair Representation Act, which for those of you who know David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, he was an example of someone that really has become excited about this policy and wrote an op-ed called "The Best Way to Save America" is the Fair Representation Act. That would apply ranked choice voting as a form of proportional representation in multi-member districts. And I didn't really go through how that works. If you go to our website or go to fairrepresentation.com, which goes right to the pages, you can see how that works. But that's a really transformative change that's also being used in more local elections. There's bills just to make it easier to use ranked choice voting. HR 1, which is a bill that passed the House, sort of a democracy omnibus bill, was a bill that included a provision that say all voting equipment needed to be ready to run ranked choice voting elections. Michael Bennet, who ran as a Democratic nominee for president last year, he has a bill that would create a pilot program and some funding to help cities and states use ranked choice voting. Those kinds of bills, I think, can start moving both nationally and in states. And we did have 5 states adopt ranked choice voting for the presidential primaries. These actually were parties that made that decision this year in party-run contests. But Maine has adopted it for their presidential primary in 2024. And I think the arguments are very compelling for both parties. This is just good for their party to do for 2024. And that's a national policy, but ultimately needs to be pursued state by state. There's a lot of changes happening in states. The most ambitious and exciting is in Maine. It's on the ballot, or almost certainly will be, in both Alaska and Massachusetts this November in different forms. Could be 1 or 2 other states still that might do that. Just passed in Virginia, by the way, as a local option, and establishing the chance for Virginia to do what all these Utah cities are starting to do. And I live in Washington, D.C., or right near it, and right across the Potomac River is Arlington, Virginia. And they already do it at the party level for their local elections, and I think they're a really good prospect to pass ranked choice voting in the next year. Over 20 cities now use it, and we're really excited about its first use next year in New York City, where open seat race for mayor, almost everything else seems to be in play, and ranked choice voting will be a huge part of that. So there's more about FairVote. You can get involved with FairVote. You can find out more about what might be going on in your state. I know that the Represent Us chapter in New Jersey is particularly energized by working on ranked choice voting, and in pretty much every state, something is starting to happen. So certainly visit us at FairVote to either connect with what we're trying to do nationally, or to find out who's doing something in your state. So I'm going to get out of this share mode and see if we can get into the Q&A part. So I see there's some questions that have already been asked. And I can start taking a look at those, and we'll sort of take it from there. So here's the first question that came up: how many choices can you make? Do you rank all the candidates? So raise your hand if you're from Australia. No, I'm just kidding. But Australia has had ranked choice voting for more than a century, and there they require you to rank all the candidates. They require you to vote, mandatory voting, and they have mandatory ranking. That's not something that any of the U.S. uses of ranked choice voting are doing or are likely to do. What we're seeing is that people like to rank. For instance, that ballot in Alaska and Wyoming, you could rank up to 5 Democratic candidates, and the average candidate, the average voter ranked 4. So first time use of ranked choice voting, the percentage of people that cast a valid ballot was incredibly high, by the way. You know, fewer than 1 out of 500 people made a mistake that made their ballot not count in this very first use of it, and the average number of people ranked 4. So it really depends on kind of what the choices are before you and what you want to do as a voter. So look at other questions here. Are there better ways to determine who is least favored eliminated besides least first choices? There are other ways to determine who is least favored, but I would say that a part of what you want in a system is something that just seems logical to people, and I think that that ranked choice voting has sort of passed the logic test. It's been used in a whole lot of places. People don't always like who wins under any system, and when they don't get their favorite candidate winning, they can feel grouchy. But you know, it's sort of logical that if you finish last, that you're out. You know, there is a whole science of voting that this guy Kenneth Arrow got the Nobel Prize for work that included some really important work on voting methods, and he basically made a clear proof that there's always some flaw with any ranked system, which, you know, rankings give you more information to work with, so always better than plurality voting where you just get to vote for one. But there's always a way to say, oh, that's not a fair outcome or something. You know, there's always something that isn't quote unquote perfect. So I think we have to recognize that in the spirit of our framers, we're looking for a more perfect union, not an absolutely perfect world. But ranked choice voting certainly for me gets a much better outcome. Is this a better choice for just primaries? Asks Eileen Kahn. And I think it is a very logical choice for primaries. And there's different overlapping arguments for using ranked choice voting for primaries and general elections. In primary elections, when you think of the goal of a party, is they're trying to select a nominee, and this is for any office, by the way, not just for president, who kind of unites the big tent, right? The parties are supposed to be big tents in our system, and can appeal across the party, stand as their nominee, and, you know, earn support in the general election. And ranked choice voting just really does that well. It you know, the winner has to get there with more votes. They have to appeal for second and third choice support. Primaries often have more than 2 candidates. You know, the dynamic now is because of winner-take-all elections and the sort of fierce partisan division in this country, is that most general elections for Congress and state legislature and in states in the presidential race are effectively decided before the general election, right? We all know who is going to win, you know, 90%. In fact, FairVote does this projection model for House races where, you know, 2 days after the 2018 election, we projected well over 80% of the US House races for 2020, and using a methodology that gets like about 1 wrong every 1,000. You know, it's just that predictable. So when you have like an open seat race in one of those predictable races, the side that knows it's going to win in November, like 7 people run or 12 people run or whatever, and ranked choice voting is particularly good. I will say, though, it makes, to me, tons of sense in the general election also. And, you know, we have sort of a couple examples to think about, right? So those ones back in the 90s and 2000 at the presidential level, where the entry of Ross Perot, the entry of Ralph Nader can affect the outcome. You know, Justin Amash, the congressman from Michigan, who is a former Republican, who theoretically might cut into the Republican vote, but also is a libertarian who is, you know, for liberal policies on drugs and war and peace, you know, conceivably could cut into the anti-Trump vote, and who knows? But he's considering running for president, and that decision and being on the ballot could have much more of an effect on the outcome than, say, you know, a major change in access to voting or something, because it could affect 4 or 5% of the vote. You know, we make our system vulnerable by not handling that possibility. But on the flip side, I think people like Justin Amash should be able to put their voice forward. I think not everyone in the United States is satisfied with the choice between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And I think that those who want to have additional choices in our system ideally should have them. And I think ranked choice voting does a good thing for permitting them. Will people be confused about how it works? I think that is a frequent concern. It actually is a one we can really safely answer now, which on the voting side, you know, people are handling this exceptionally well. And with that, I think comes a basically intuition that your first choice is your favorite and your second choice is your next favorite. That sort of logic of the candidate you love, the candidate you like. Voters can certainly do that, translate that into the ballot. And they can, when they're doing that, that's a smart way to vote. You know, that if someone who doesn't know much about ranked choice voting, and I, as a voter who knows a lot about ranked choice voting, go in with similar preferences, we almost certainly will vote the same way. You know, we will have the same preferences, and it didn't help me that I knew all what I know about ranked choice voting, and that's a good thing. That's a really good test of a system. Where I think we as advocates need to keep doing good work is explaining outcomes and explaining how they're fair. I think they are fair, but I think people need to always accept outcomes, and you know, every now and then, in a really important election, you will, in a very important way, a candidate who leads in first choices will then lose, and they'll lose because the candidate who was behind them was better at attracting the support of the candidates that got defeated. And that's exactly why the system is in place, to make sure that those outcomes are protected, that the majority gets its way. But if I'm a backer of the candidate who was led in first choices and loses, I need to accept that. And in countries that have had this for a while, you know, Ireland's had it for a long time, Australia, you know, it's accepted. People grumble, but you know, you win some, you lose some. And as we get it first introduced, that's I think a really kind of important thing for us to deal with. And I think there's more and more evidence that we can deal with it in a really positive way. I'm just sort of going through these questions one by one. How does ranked choice voting interact with the Electoral College? It's actually going to have a good test this year in Maine. It is going to be used in the, oops, where am I here? I keep thinking I'm going to see people, but I'm just, hi, Rhoda, I keep seeing you.
Yeah, I know, it's kind of strange, isn't it?
So I'm just zipping along here without really seeing people and seeing if they're shaking their head or whatever. But anyway, so Maine is using ranked choice voting for president. And actually Maine's interesting because when you vote for president in Maine, the way they do the Electoral College in Maine, of course, the Electoral College is a state-based system for, you know, governed by state statute. They give 2 electoral votes to whoever wins statewide in Maine. And then in 2016, Hillary Clinton won Maine, but with less than half the votes. Then they give an electoral vote for who wins each of its 2 congressional districts. So they actually have 3 contests that get decided in Maine, and they'll be using ranked choice voting. And it's a good bet that 1 or 2 of those at least will be quite possibly affected by ranked choice voting. So the way it would affect the Electoral College in Maine is that rather than just automatically giving the electoral votes to whoever finishes first, you would say, did that candidate win a majority and did they win the instant runoff? And so in those examples of like Ralph Nader's impact in Florida or Ross Perot's impact in like allowing Clinton to win Montana in '92 or those kinds of effects, the candidate would have to win a majority to get that system of electoral college. I've actually just done an article I did a talk at Harvard last fall, and it's been turned into an article that I've just been doing the last wrap up on, which is sort of about a whole way that it can be built into the popular vote plan for president, the National Popular Vote Plan. And there's actually a statutory solutions for how it could be combined with that movement for a popular vote. But sort of even aside from changing to a popular vote election nationally, you can certainly use it state by state. How has ranked choice voting improved representation for marginalized and underrepresented communities in places that are using it? There are some really interesting examples of what it means. I will say that this is an important example of the impact of the choice of what kind of ranked choice voting that you're using. So the typical system that people hear the most about that's being used most around the country is the winner take all version, where it's, you have one winner and you got to get over 50%, right? And that in itself doesn't necessarily help someone who's underrepresented and a minority, right, to be able to win when you need to win a majority. Here's what it does do, though, in even that alone, is that those voters, or any voter, right, their second and third choice matters. And when New York City passed this last year, a charter commission put it on the ballot. Put it on the ballot 13-1. It was a really interesting, thoughtful, very diverse charter commission in one of the most diverse, cities on the planet. And one of the real things that was attractive to people was the idea that winners would have to need to reach outside their own community, whatever that community might be, geographic, racial, political views, and work hard to get second and third choices and try to bring people in. So in that way, there's sort of a direct, different impact that's more inclusionary. The most sustained use of ranked choice voting in that sort of single winner system in the modern era is in the Bay Area, where 4 cities use it there. Bay Area is very diverse. And it's at a relatively constant level of diversity during that time, but it's not just white African-American, it's, white African-American, Latino, Asian American, different kinds of diversity within that. And during that time, there's 53 offices elected by ranked choice voting in the Bay Area. And people of color have went from winning those same seats before ranked choice voting was used, where they won 2 out of 5, 40% of those races, to 3 out of 5, 60%. That's a really big change. Part of it is now the elections are all held in November, when turnout is higher and it's more diverse. And I think the fact that those dynamics of needing to reach out to second and third choices kind of like take some of the edge off of kind of racially tinged politics. We don't really quite know why it's doing what it's doing, but it clearly is having a positive impact. And women have had a similar positive impact. My wife runs a group called Represent Women, which looks at sort of systemic structural rules and how they impact women's chances of winning office. And she's zeroed in with a lot of interest on different voting systems. And ranked choice voting's had a really interesting positive impact on women winning mayoral elections. Maine has its first governor who is a woman ever, and she won a very competitive 7-way primary race in 2018. Still anecdotal. We're still trying to see why it does this, but it does seem to have an impact on women. And I'll just say the last thing is that when you go to the proportional version of ranked choice voting, which is this multi-member district system, so like Cambridge, Massachusetts, they have 9 seats elected to their city council. They all run at large, which a lot of cities in the United States do. You rank the candidates just the same way. Now you don't need 50% to win a seat, you need 10% to win. 10% to win 1, 20% to win 2, 30% to win 3, and so on. A majority of just over 50% will win a majority of seats, over 5 out of 9, but not all the seats, right? So there's more seats for everyone to have a chance to win. And that system has a really direct and obvious impact on those in the minority to be able to help elect someone, with all the other impacts about the ranked ballot and inclusion going on as well. And that's something that we think, it's ultimately would be exceptionally good for our country. That's the Fair Representation Act proposal. It has that most direct impact on that question. So going on to the next question, as an average citizen, and without, I'm chuckling just because I can't see someone saying, yes, you answered my question. I'm like, I hope I'm answering the questions and not at too much length. As an average citizen, what could I do to help advance RCV in my state? Well, great question, John. There is a lot that you can do. I mentioned at the end of the presentation that you can go to FairVote and look at the Get Involved volunteer section. We have some real national goals. We are going to be articulating those with a new set of 4-year plan this summer that people will hear about, but they're the ones that we think can be achieved nationally. And in tandem with all the state and local work that's also going on. It depends on the state what's possible. In some states, you can actually win ranked choice voting in your city right now. In some states, the state doesn't allow a city to do ranked choice voting. New Jersey is such a state. I know Hoboken, there's been a lot of interest in ranked choice voting there. And I think the city council, a big majority voted to ask the legislature to allow them to use ranked choice voting. I will say this, we're at this sort of tipping point. I don't know if we're quite at a tipping point. We're at a very close to a tipping point of, I think, acceptance of this as a reasonable way to vote and just broadly sensible. And that's really where I think we are going to get to. And I think that conversation can happen in cities and states all across the country. And there are uses of ranked choice voting in every state, most local elections. It just makes sense right now, and the logistics of how to do it are getting easier. I'll do a shout out to a group called the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, rankchoicevoting.org. They are a great resource for the logistics and the mechanics of using ranked choice voting, and they work with election officials, and they're doing a great job on that. I know it's a hard-won battle in Maine, then contested congressional race. Why do politicians seem to dislike RCV? Well, that's an interesting way to think about it. I think politicians are actually often liking ranked choice voting. Not everybody likes outcomes with that happen in a ranked choice voting election. I will say that in Maine, it was quite a roller coaster. The win in Maine was a really exciting, well done, sort of relatively populist campaign. There was a lot of support for ranked choice voting, but the legislature decided not to pass it. This was, say, 2011, 2012. And people came together and did a ballot measure. And the legislature is always kind of like, hey, we're not necessarily excited that you're going around us to do this. But they won it. And they won that in 2016. That was something that FairVote had an important role in too, but there was an incredibly strong local effort to do that. The League of Women Voters of Maine group called the Committee for Ranked Choice Voting. And then it had to be implemented in 2017. There was a bad court ruling that made it look like it might not be legal for governor on the general election. There was debates about how much it would cost. And they, cravenly did to vote to suspend basic use of ranked choice voting, effectively repeal it. But Maine is a state where you could do a referendum. And so advocates came together, did a referendum to bring back into play the clearly legal parts of ranked choice voting, which we're using it for all the primary elections, and then for all the federal elections in November, at that point, just US Senate and US House. That got put on the ballot in June 2018. The voters voted with it in the primaries and then turned around and gave it an even bigger margin to pass it and to keep it. And so then they used it in November for Congress. All the sort of things people said about like, oh, it won't work and things didn't come true as far as like voters being able to handle it. And there's sort of two parts of interpreting what happened next. One, that experience led the legislature the next year, 2019, to extend ranked choice voting to president. So do politicians dislike RCV? Certainly the majority in Maine decided to extend it for president. However, the incumbent member of Congress in the 2nd Congressional District of Maine, the Northern District, led in first choices and then lost. So he was very unhappy. and his party was not as happy. And so it's become a bit more, for the moment, kind of politically polarized in Maine. But I think it's very sort of short-term, not very thoughtful kind of critiques like, oh, I lost an election, so it must be the system's fault. And I think that what we're seeing is like Utah is a good example where a lot of Republicans are using ranked choice voting, liking it. They're using it for their statewide convention right now. And I think that the fact that these 4 Democratic parties chose to do it for president, and that was entirely their decision, is an example of how it just sort of solves problems. So I think that there's a certain novelty impact, but I think that in general we're enthusiastic, or we're optimistic that this can be won through legislatures across the country. Next question from, if I'm saying the name right, Nike Bach, is, I was thinking that RCV could take the place of winner take all and thus make electoral college votes closer to popular votes. Is there a link between RCV and electoral college process we use to elect the president? So I actually did talk a little bit about that, and you can keep ranked choice voting with the electoral college, state by state. You could actually build it into the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which is something that I believe would be a good change for this country, and that's passed in I guess 15 states in DC now, I believe, and is on a trajectory, I think, to affect presidential elections. And if we ever do a constitutional amendment to have direct election of the president, I think it should be done with ranked choice voting. And I think that the track record that we're creating now will make that conversation a very real one. Are other states in a similar position to Maryland at the state level, introducing legislation to update voting equipment and then moving to approve RCV subsequently? That's a sophisticated question. I think that the voting equipment challenge has been incredibly frustrating over the years. We have had politicians and we've had people elected office say, oh, I really want to do ranked choice voting, and then get told that their voting equipment isn't ready. And that can really stall the opportunity to go to RCV. What's exciting is that barrier is not universally removed, but it's getting increasingly removed. It's one that there's some transition costs that still may need to be there. Some states and cities, not much of a transition cost even. It's just kind of like, yep, we can pull that switch and get it in. The new federal guidelines for voting systems governing voting equipment have ranked choice voting criteria and standards built into it. The voting equipment vendors are just starting to put it in there. It never has been like a rocket science problem. It's just sort of getting it into the systems and regulated and certified and so on. So I think that we always were this sort of catch-22. Can we get legislation to change the voting equipment before you have ranked choice voting? And it would say, well, you don't have ranked choice voting, so why get the voting equipment ready? And we say, well, we can't win ranked choice voting because the voting equipment isn't ready. And this sort of whole cycle kept going. We still think it's a good thing to try to do to get the voting equipment ready, but I think at this point, we also can just be winning ranked choice voting, and the voting equipment can get ready at that point. So I think we don't have to do that traditional, we're sort of getting out of that traditional circle. So Eileen says, I'm the president of my local League of Women Voters, and would like an opportunity to be educators on this. That's exciting. I'll say that a number of League of Women Voter groups at the state level have studied ranked choice voting and supported it. I think we're up to something like 15. There's a conversation going on within the National League at its national convention about taking a position, sort of a general principle-based position about voting methods that would make it all the more straightforward for a league to decide to work on ranked choice voting. But I would agree the league is well positioned to be educators, and they've been doing a great job in a number of the cities that have passed RCV. They've been direct parts of the education work. Yeah, this is a good question. How does it disincentivize gerrymandering? And it's contextual. But if you do the multi-district version, the one where you elect more than one person, it effectively, at a certain point, makes gerrymandering impossible or or virtually impossible or just almost irrelevant. In today's politics, any single member district system isn't necessarily an intentional gerrymander in the sense of like, bad actors trying to like rig the outcomes to help their friends and hurt their enemies. But at the very least, it's an unintentional gerrymander in that most districts that get created, however they get created, are going to be safe for one party or the other. In the politics we have of today, state lines have been consistent for some time, but you can think of them as gerrymanders in that 34 states have not had a general election presidential campaign event by the major candidates since the 2000 election, the same 34 states, because at this point they're safely Democratic or safely Republican, and the candidates never campaigned there. And that's, not due to gerrymandering, but it effectively has sidelined all those voters. And that's what, single member districts inherently do. When you have multi-member districts and ranked choice voting with a proportional fair representation formula, really voters are always in charge. And if you go to that fairrepresentation.com website, you'll see more about just how that works. Would there be a limit to how many people could run? It could get confusing if 100 people were running. I think if 100 people are running under any system, that probably would be challenging. Ballot access is its own rule. I think that what we're seeing with ranked choice voting is it sort of accommodates the choice you have. I think particularly a two-person race might have 4 people, or like there might be more people when you're particularly the candidates who aren't running are doing so out of sort of the shaming and spoiler problem of third and fourth party candidates trying to run in our current system. Australia has had it for a long, long time. I think they have relatively straightforward ballot access rules. When they vote in their single winner House races, the median number of candidates is 7. People seem happy with it. They seem fine with it. And that's something that I think kind of like voters can handle that. You don't necessarily need to know all the candidates. The ones who are the most serious candidates, you will likely get a chance to hear some more about. But that's sort of a calibration that can happen sort of outside of the ranked choice system. It's really about a ballot access rule. Someone caught a good typo that someone did, me or someone else. Okay, will ranked choice voting encourage more third-party candidates? Well, we actually just talked about that a little bit. I think that even right now, like, we will have a Green Party candidate for president in 2020. We will have a Libertarian Party candidate. Justin Amash, the congressman, may run as Libertarian nominee, may run as independent. So we do have third parties running now. There is always this sort of vicious debate where the third party candidates are saying, let me run, I should be in the debates, don't just call me a spoiler, and backers of a threatened major party, not threatened that I think they'll lose, but just maybe we'll lose some votes to them, saying you shouldn't run, and like you're splitting the vote and get out of the race. And we keep kind of going through this cycle, and ranked choice voting would be such a relief to kind of get out of that cycle. And that would allow kind of a more calm consideration of the ideas that a third party or an independent candidate could bring. Howard Dean, the former Vermont governor and head of the Democratic Party for 4 years, had a great op-ed in the New York Times in 2016, sort of making exactly that point. Like, let's just get out of this vicious cycle we keep having and just let us have ranked choice voting and let the voters figure it out. And, I think that's ultimately the place for us to go. There was a question again about PR, proportional representation, and gerrymandering. I hope my early answer addressed that. So there's a question, where did the idea of ranked choice voting come from? There's sort of multiple origins. In some ways, the first time someone, asked for one thing and didn't get it and had to go for the backup, ranked choice voting was invented, way back in, some transaction in Mesopotamia or something, because that's really what's going on. Like, you go to the ice cream store and say, hey, can I have butter pecan? They say, we don't have butter pecan. I say, well, yeah, you have chocolate? And like, hey, I've just done ranked choice voting. But the idea of applying it to voting, there was a guy named Thomas Ware Thomas Hare invented sort of the multi-member proportional version of ranked choice voting. And John Stuart Mill, the very articulate British political philosopher, became a big enthusiast, and some of his writings about it are still live today as just really good writings about it. That was in the late 1850s, early 1860s. And then William Ware over in the US kind of said, hey, we could use this for single winner elections. If you go to my Twitter, I have a link to an NBC story that just ran recently. It has actually a really nice graphic demonstration of ranked choice voting. I have a couple quotes from me in it, and it has like a nice little history that includes those early years. The first adoptions of it were later in the 1800s, you know, it's been kind of, it's had a whole interesting run, including some early adoptions in the US, and we've been plagued by the kind of the voting equipment challenges, which is why it's such a relief that I think we're finally getting over the voting equipment challenges. So do you like RCV's chances in Massachusetts? I think Massachusetts has a great campaign. There's a group called Voter Choice Massachusetts. They have done so much good work to kind of lay the ground for this, a really ideal kind of people-led effort to that really kind of came out organically. They were excited by what happened in Maine in 2016, and so people came together and said, can we do this here? And it's kind of interesting because Massachusetts didn't have a super compelling quote unquote spoiler dynamic that like led everyone to say, oh, we've got to solve that problem. Like Maine had 11 races for governor, and 9 of them had been won with less than 50%, and the last 3 governors had won with less than 40%. So there was big conversation about that, and that wasn't really happening as much in Massachusetts, but this took off. It was well organized. You can never say a statewide ballot measure is an easy thing to do, and so we will see how it goes. But I think they've really done a lot of good work to get there, and it is, I think, one of the a flagship opportunity. So hope it goes well. Check out Voter Choice Massachusetts. How does RCV work with using mail-in ballots? I understand the state of Massachusetts uses mail-in ballots for all voting. Would that make it harder to calculate? Well, it's interesting. In the PowerPoint, I shared those election results from Alaska, and Wyoming just had them as well. Those were vote by mail elections. So why in the middle of this terrible, COVID-19 situation, they were able to keep their vote going was they were having everyone vote at home, sort of voting by mail, and they all used ranked choice voting. So they all got ballots in the mail, and turnout jumped from what it had been before. When you mail a ballot, it means you don't have a chance to fix the ballot if you make a mistake. Like you're in person and you do a mistake, they can take the ballot and say, you know what, the machine just rang a bell and it says that it looks like that you made a mistake. So you didn't get that chance. And more than 99.8% of people's ballot didn't have a mistake on the first choice. And a majority of people ranked 4 candidates. So that's pretty cool. So I think that they go well together. I think that when you have vote at home, when you have vote by mail, and you have the presidential contest happening, one after the other, the way that we do, or 3 after the other, or suddenly Super Tuesday, and you have candidates dropping out, and you vote early and your favorite drops out, or it doesn't do very well in a debate, and you're sort of like kicking yourself that you wasted your vote on someone. Ranked choice voting is such a sensible tool to kind of handle that problem. So I think they go really well together. Would an RCV affect negative campaigning? Could this actually result in voters possibly getting less information, even if it's dirt about the candidates? So here's the way that it does affect it in a directly positive way. And you really see this playing out. If you have some hope that a voter who likes someone else will rank you second, or rank you third, or rank you fourth in a way that might help your campaign, you now have a reason to talk to them. There was actually a really good TV story out of Portland, Maine, with the biggest city in Maine, uses ranked choice voting, and kind of a cool story. They've used it for mayor for the last 3 cycles, but only for mayor. And then they put it on the ballot just a few weeks ago, or in March, to extend it to all their city elections, and it got over 80% of the vote. So that shows that the people of Portland used it for mayor, used it 3 times and said, you know what, this is great. And they, more than 80% want to use it for everything. But anyway, they did this TV story following the candidates the last day of the campaign, like the last day of the campaign trail, what the local TV does. And what was fun is that each of the 3 candidates that they followed were in other parties' strongholds, other candidates' strongholds, and walking past signs for their opponent. But at that point in the campaign, the best way for they to win was to be the candidate that did a better job of getting second and third choices. And those were the swing voters in a certain sense. And so if you've really been a jerk about that candidate, you might not get the second and third choice. Like, it's one thing to distinguish yourself. It's another thing to be, overly negative and attack oriented. So I think it creates incentives for more responsible campaigning. It doesn't mean everyone's is going to be sweetness and light. And if you don't have much belief that you're going to get a second or third choice from someone, and that would be in a partisan election, I think, kind of a really conservative Republican, a very liberal Democrat, and then, you've got some other candidates, they probably don't, they'll be pretty negative against one another. But the other voters will notice that. And I think the main congressional race where the outcome changed, what was interesting is the incumbent Republican congressman ran a classic base-oriented campaign and was actually publicly dismissive of the independent candidates who got 10% of the vote between them. And he was like, they don't have anything going for them. And, and just was kind of like running for 45%. And that's what he got. And then he didn't get 50% because he was really not good at getting second and third choices. So I think it kind of, creates some incentives to be a candidate that seems willing and interested in trying to earn a majority. Now, is it perfect? Will there still be negative campaigning? Sure, right? Like, there's still going to be things going on, but is it better? That's what I think is true that it is. So Melvin asks, what is the optimal number of members in a multi-member district for proportional representation? The more people elected, the more proportional it is. So actually, I would mention that, John Stuart Mill was an enthusiast. He was talking about like running nationwide in the United Kingdom. That would be like super inclusive. But when people talked about confusing ballots, that would be a pretty long ballot. What we have settled on, and what the Fair Representation Act has, and it's not the be-all end-all of what has to happen, but we, in the Fair Representation Act, which Don Beyer has put forward the last couple cycles, would establish districts mostly of 5 seats. So when it takes 5 seats in a proportional system to win, it takes a little less than 20% of the vote to win one of those seats. And that would really create competition across every part of the country. We've actually simulated that in today's congressional districts, and if you sort of randomly create districts, almost every single district, both major parties would have the power to help elect someone, and minor parties and independent candidates would have a whole new access opportunity. That's at least something that is, as a conversation starter, that's something that we think makes sense. How does ranked choice voting impact the influence of money in elections, which is a really interesting question, because it's something that we're still learning about, at least at the local level. Here's something that's sort of interesting to me about how it seems to play out, which is that earning second and third choices doesn't come down to name recognition. It comes down to some kind of interaction that the candidate does, either themselves or through proxies, where the backers of other candidates believe that they are being listened to, that they can respect the person. Because, your first choice is somebody else. But, like, okay, well, at least you're listening, at least you're trying, at least you've done something to reach out to me. And the way to do that is often, at least in, again, these city campaigns, which can be like a big city race for mayor or something, is getting out there in either directly in the community or some other means, like getting to community events or something. And so we've had a number of races where the biggest spending candidate didn't win. And I think that doesn't mean the biggest spending candidate can't win. It just means that they sometimes rely on old methodologies. and that I think, their consultants run the old style campaign. And I think that what we're seeing is you have to run new styles of campaigning. And when you do that, having more money, helps, but it isn't always decisive. When you use the proportional system, that multi-member district version, where you actually kind of let more voters help elect someone, I think money is even less directly connected to who wins and loses. Has anyone moved to an RCV system and then moved back to the old way? Sadly, that has happened, and not everything is a positive trajectory for change in the United States. That hasn't happened in a long time, but there were a couple cities a decade ago that had passed in kind of the early phases. And some of that is that the early implementations, you had to kind of like work through, kind of work around solutions for the voting equipment and so on. But we have not had a city that had passed ranked choice voting move against it for a decade. And during that time, we've had the number of cities passing it, more than triple. And I think that we're up to past 20. And I don't see any kind of negative pushback against RCV in any of the cities with it right now. So I think we're on a good trajectory. That was the last of the questions that I'm seeing. And let me go back to the screen here. We still have 43 people. But are there any questions? I think I went through and answered what I saw there. Rhoda, do you have a question for me?
Well, I was thinking, first of all, I want to thank you for such an informative presentation. I learned a lot, and I have a feeling everybody else did too. So it would be great to applaud you. And I thought there was some great questions also.
Yes.
As I was listening to the questions and some of your responses, I was wondering if maybe ranked choice voting, in your opinion, might have a positive effect on mitigating polarization.
That's a good question, and certainly a very pertinent question today, because we are living in a time of polarization. And I think that's one of the real compelling reasons why we've seen the progress that we're seeing for it. It has an impact in two different ways. So one is just the very fact that you're having these ballots where you can say who your second choice is and your third choice is, right? And that it changes the engagement between voter and candidate in just this fascinating way, that you're giving the voter more power, right? They can now have a second and third choice. And you as a candidate know that. And so you just, you have to talk to people, and you have to talk to people outside your base. And you might not always get their votes, but it might be the difference between winning and losing. And this is this number that really fascinates me. In these really competitive mayoral races, like San Francisco had an open seat race for mayor 2018, really competitive, 8 candidates. And the top 3 candidates, 2 of the 3 formed actually a public team together. They had been endorsed by one party. They ran ads together. And then the other person, who was also of that party but didn't get endorsed by it, was kind of separate and was the front runner. So you would think that kind of like the edge, like the typical polarization kind of edge between like a candidate running against 2 people that had kind of endorsed each other. If you looked at the balance, as we were able to, because you get a lot of data from these elections, the winner, who was ultimately the candidate who didn't run as a team, was a woman named London Breed. She was ranked second or third by half the people who backed the person who finished second, even though those voters were sort of theoretically aligned against her or something like that. And he got ranked second or third by half of her supporters, right? And they both knew that mattered because it might have affected who won and lost. So even though there was sort of a dynamic of polarization, they also did a really good job of connecting with each other's voters. So when you apply that to our partisan elections, it would just create incentives to, at the very least, kind of take the edge off of politics. And if we had third partisan independents sort of regularly in general elections, there would be this different kind of accountability structure. So if you're running as a real polarizing base-oriented candidate, you might not get to 50%, and that would really change you. I think In the primaries, it certainly rewards the candidates that are uniters rather than dividers. Then, if you go to the proportional multi-member district version, that is, I think, the real most dynamic impact on polarization, because think of it this way, is that there would be no part of the country, except like some state that only has a single House member, but any state that has more than one House member, every constituent would have both a Democrat and Republican representing them, and often more than one Democrat or more than one Republican who would be kind of different parts of their party. And those representatives would share constituents and have reasons to talk to one another when they're doing policy that affects their district. They'd be sharing constituents, sharing responsibilities. And I think that that kind of shared representation dynamic would just be very powerful for it. Now, the roots of polarization are deep in this country right now. They're not something you can just wish away with a statute, but I think that electoral rules create incentives, and I think ranked choice voting, and particularly combined with multi-member districts, creates really positive incentives.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think we have a lot of fans for this in New Jersey and elsewhere. I think it's beginning to look like a very powerful tool for transforming our democracy, something we really need to do. So thank you so much. We're going to be in touch with you. And if there are any questions that people have, once we close this program, they can send it in to info@nfrpp.org, and we'll get them answered.
And Rhoda, I'll just quickly answer the last two. I'll be quick. So there says, are there any cities or places that use RCV in the general but not in the primary? Yes. In fact, Benton County, Oregon has passed ranked choice voting, has partisan elections. And this year it's using it for the first time, and it's not using it in the primary, but it is using it in the general. So, and New York City is the other way around. They're using it in the primary next year, but not the general. So you can, pick and choose, though we like the idea of using it for both. And then Ron asked, if I were to live in a 5-member congressional district, which member do I call it for constituent service? If you say any one of them, it means each one would need to prepare to serve 5 times the population of the traditional district. Is that a big waste, redundancy of resources? One thing that's interesting is, like, New Jersey has 2-member districts for the legislature. I and Maryland have 3 members. They're winner take all elected, but this is in the Maryland legislature. And we have a lot of multi-member districts out there. So we're not creating something that hasn't been done. The way it plays out, and I'll just be personal, the way that it plays out for me. So I have 3 members of our Maryland House of Representatives. I have 5 on the county council, 4 at large, and my local one. And what it tends to work out for is you feel akin to one of them more than others. So that's the person you might usually reach out to. They do kind of coordinate and talk to one another. And you sometimes see a case where one person sort of like, yeah, I don't really do much, you should talk to the other offices. I'm really focused on policy or something like, and if you like what they're doing on policy, they can keep getting elected. So I think that it is a really important question about constituent service in our system. I think that it is something that can be kind of worked out kind of with the representatives. And the last thing I'll say is it is done already in our current system. So I guess that'll be my last answer of the question. Rhoda.
Yes, and thank you again. It was terrific. I know everybody enjoyed it, I'm sure. And we'll follow up with you.
Thank you. And I really appreciate all the people who came. And thank you, Rhoda, for convening this.
Thank you, Rob.
Yeah, good night.
Pleasure. Good night, everybody. Good night, Rob.